Good morning. Thank you. Okay. Good morning. I personally really enjoy MLK Day because I like being black and I like talking about my blackness. With my blackness comes a culture that cannot be replicated, no matter how many box braids others try to put in their head or how many I'm finnas they force into their vernacular. But most importantly, when I think of my blackness, I try to take time to thank the ancestors who've allowed me to attend a school like this or live in the neighborhoods that I've grown up in, for example. Upon these reflections, an invigorating wave of great pride rushes through me. A nonviolent social movement and campaign started on May 17, 1954, the Civil Rights Movement aimed to abolish racial segregation and disenfranchisement here in the U.S. Through the success of its nonviolent resistance and civil disobedience campaigns, the movement eventually secured new protections under federal law for the civil rights of all Americans, the movement eventually ending officially on August 1, 1968. New rulings by the federal judiciary include Brown v. Board of Education in 1954, which overruled Plessy v. Ferguson's separate but equal precedent, Browder v. Gale in 1956, which ruled bus segregation unconstitutional, and also includes decisions against anti-miscegenation and interracial marriage laws through McLovin v. Florida in 1964 and Loving v. Virginia in 1967. As of now, we're familiar with, or at least should be familiar with, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, and Representative John Lewis, for example, as trailblazers of the movement. But today, I allow myself and 5 other black girls to enlighten you all about a few of the unsung black heroines of the American Civil Rights Movement.
American political activist, philosopher, academic, and author, Angela Davis is an international symbol of the struggle for black liberation, anti-capitalism, and feminism. I first learned about Angela Davis about a year ago when I saw her speak at Malcolm X's 58th memoriam. After this, I took it upon myself to learn more about Angela and what she's done for the civil rights movement. Today, I'll take the time to speak to you about Angela and her life. Angela Davis was born in Birmingham, Alabama in 1944. From an early age, she was exposed to both racism and activism. Although speaking about civil rights in Birmingham was an extremely explosive topic, Angela's mother participated in black civil rights organizations, refusing to stay silent. During her teen years, Angela went to a progressive high school, which reinforced the values instilled in her by her parents. Angela went on to study abroad for college and earned a PhD in philosophy. When Angela returned to the U.S., she became more and more involved in the civil rights movement. Angela was drawn to the Black Panther and Communist parties. She was an active member of both parties, deeply committed to advocating for civil rights and black power. In 1969, Angela became a professor of philosophy at UCLA, but was soon fired for her inflammatory rhetoric, despite her excellent record as an instructor. Around the same time she lost her job, Davis became invested in the Soledad Brothers Defense Committee, 3 black men who were accused of killing a white prison guard. However, during George Jackson's trial in August 1970, an escape attempt was made at gunpoint and several people were killed. Davis was accused of taking part in the event and was charged with murder along with other charges. Evidence showed that the guns were registered to her, and rumors said she was in love with Jackson, which all of this later proved untrue. Davis went into hiding and was placed on the FBI's most wanted list. Upon her arrest in October, President Nixon congratulated the FBI on the capture of the dangerous terrorist Angela Davis. She spent 18 months in jail, which led to the Free Angela campaign and the Angela Davis Legal Defense Committee. In spite of this, her time in prison only added fuel to her passion for equality and justice. Angela was not a dangerous terrorist, but a political prisoner who was unfairly targeted because of her political beliefs and activist work. Buttons, posters, and other advocacy materials were created to raise awareness about her plight. Angela became an international symbol of resistance. John Lennon and Yoko Ono wrote Angela, and the Rolling Stones wrote Sweet Black Angela in honor of her. On June 4, 1972, Angela Davis was found not guilty on all charges. After her time in prison, she founded several advocacy organizations, including the National Alliance Against Racist and Political Oppression. Angela returned to teaching and published several books. She speaks out about prison reform, women's rights, racial equality, and the inequality of capitalism. Angela is also an advocate for the LGBTQ community and came out as a lesbian in the late 1990s. Today, she is a distinguished professor emerita of the history of consciousness at the University of California in Santa Cruz. She continues to be an unwavering thought leader and advocate for equality for all Americans. So, if you're like me and only recently learned about Angela Davis, I encourage you to look more closely into the unsung heroines of the civil rights movement. Thank you.
Another one of our heroes of this time was Ella Baker. She was an African American civil and human rights activist. She was born in Virginia in 1903, but grew up in North Carolina, and then later died in 1986 in New York. She worked alongside many individuals like MLK, Thurgood Marshall, and W.E.B. Du Bois, and some of her organizations include the NAACP, MLK Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and she's also a founder of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. So as one of the founders of the SNCC, she was inspired by the sit-ins and also the Montgomery boycotts to fight Jim Crow laws. She later left the SCLC because of her passion and strong belief in younger activists. And to accomplish her goals, she teamed with students from different colleges to achieve her goal. One of her biggest things that she focused on during her work was collective leadership. She believed that people needed to come together to really portray all the power they had to strengthen their community. She actually really deprioritized the charismatic leadership and defied traditional gender roles often during her work, and she really believed in the absence of hierarchical emphasis that we had in the government. She also believed that the change would come by the whole of everyone and not just some parts of people. And then another big thing that she focused on was direct action. So one of the biggest things that she focused on was voter registration and a participatory democracy. And these things included the grassroots involvement and also reducing decisions made by the elites. During my research, I found one of her most famous quotes, which says that strong people don't need strong leaders. And this quote reminded me a lot about Taft also, because I feel that although necessarily there are students who are not close with stronger leaders in the community, that we all do try and make change in our own ways. This also proves a lot about her belief in younger activists, and that is why she did pull away from stronger leaders such as MLK and focus on the activists of tomorrow.
Hi, good morning, everyone. I next want to reflect on some of the remarkable impacts and accomplishments of Claudette Colvin, born in 1939, an African-American civil rights activist during the Jim Crow era. Claudette was a 15-year-old student at Booker T. Washington High School in Montgomery, Alabama in 1954 when she was arrested for refusing to give up her seat to a white woman on a segregated bus. According to Fred Gray, who represented Claudette and would go on to represent many other key civil rights leaders, including Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King, she had already been sitting at the back of the bus when the white bus driver ordered her to get out of her seat so that the white woman could sit. Claudette was fueled by what she'd been learning in school about African American history and the Constitution, and refused to give up her seat on the grounds that she had both paid her fare and had a constitutional right to sit in her chosen seat. Despite her assertion, she was arrested by 2 police officers who dragged her off of the bus, and she was taken to jail. While in the patrol car, Claudette was repeatedly called the N-word and used other vile language that with reference to her bra size and mocking parts of her body. The behavior exhibited from the police officers caused Claudette to fear that she would be sexually assaulted on the way to the precinct. The reason I chose to bring light to Claudette's story is because often we're taught in school about Rosa Parks and her contributions to the civil rights movement, but many people are unaware that Claudette's bravery gave Miss Parks the courage to do the same 9 months later, but also because she and 4 other Black women filed a class action lawsuit that would later be presented and won at the Supreme Court, ending bus segregation. The leaders in the civil rights movement worked to uphold a positive image by featuring protesters that they considered to be the most appealing. Unfortunately, this practice led to Claudette not receiving proper recognition due to factors such as her hair type, skin tone, her age, and her future pregnancy. Concerns about potential attacks on Claudette's character overshadowed the focus on the important issues that she sought to address. Before I end, I just want to leave everyone with a very powerful quote from Claudette that ties back to one of the many lessons from Mr. Allen's presentation yesterday. I always tell young people to stand up for what you think is right, even if you have to stand alone. I just want to emphasize a small step in the right direction, and doing the right thing can be the catalyst for great change. Thank you for your time.
Next, I would like to present Diane Nash's life. Born in 1938 and native to Chicago, Diane Nash was a remarkable civil rights activist. She had had little experience with segregation until she transferred from Howard University to Fisk University in Nashville. After attending workshops led by civil rights activist James Lawson, Nash became a firm believer in nonviolent tactics. Around this time, Nash became the leader of the Student Central Committee, which was organizing a series of sit-ins at segregated facilities in Nashville's downtown area. When the businesses remained segregated, Nash took the issue to Nashville Mayor Ben West and served on the biracial committee he established to study the issue. Nash's efforts paid off in May 1960, when Nashville began integrating its lunch counters and was the first city in the South to do so. In 1960, Nash became an original Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee member. A year later, she was arrested, for the first time of many, at a staged sit-in in Rock Hill, South Carolina. Because Nash firmly believed in jail, no bail, believing it drew more attention to the cause, she served 30 days in jail. Nash remarks, "I believe that if I go to jail now, it may help hasten the day when my child and all children will be free, not only on the day of their birth, but for all of their lives." In the 1960s, Diane Nash played a crucial role in the civil rights movement, coordinating the Freedom Rides, a protest against segregation in interstate travel. Despite facing violence, Nash insisted on continuing the rides, leading to federal intervention and the enforcement of anti-segregation rulings. Nash later joined the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and participated in the 1963 March on Washington. After marrying fellow activist James Bevel and contributing to the Selma March for voting rights, Nash returned to Chicago in the late 1960s. She continued activism, engaging in protests against the Vietnam War and advocating for feminine causes, housing, and welfare in the 1970s. Nash's courageous actions played a key role in the civil rights movement, and her story is one of many that can encourage you all to become leaders in your everyday lives. Thank you.
Before she became Bell Hooks, one of the great cultural critics and writers of the 20th century, and before she inspired generations of readers, especially Black women, to understand their own axis-tilting power, she was Gloria Jean Watkin, daughter of Rosa Bell and Wiotis Watkins. She was born in 1952 and attended Kentucky segregated schools up until college. It was in the classroom that she, eager to learn, began glimpsing the liberating possibilities of education. In 1973, Watkins graduated from Stanford. As a 19-year-old undergraduate, she had already completed a draft of a visionary history on Black feminism and womanhood. In the late 70s, she began publishing poetry under the pen name Bell Hooks, a tribute to her great-grandmother, Belle Blair Hooks. The lowercase was meant to distinguish her from her great-grandmother and to suggest that what mattered was the substance of the work, not the author's name. In 1981, as Hooks, she published the work she began at Stanford, Anti-Woman, Black Women, and Feminism, a landmark book that was at once a history of slavery's legacy and the ongoing dehumanization of Black women, as well as a critique of the revolutionary politics which had arisen in response to this maltreatment. True liberation, she believed, needed to reckon with how class, race, and gender are facets of our identity and are linked. We are all of these things at once. In the 80s and 90s, Hooks taught at Yale University, Oberlin College, and the City College of New York. She was a prolific scholar and writer, publishing nearly 40 books and hundreds of articles for magazines, journals, and newspapers. She made demands of the world, for she believed the societal and political systems around us are designed to obstruct our sense of esteem and make us feel small. Yet revolution starts within each of us, in the demands we take up against the world. She believed criticism came from a place of love, a desire for things worthy of losing ourselves to. She told a Buddhist magazine in the early 90s, quote, "If I were really asked to define myself, I wouldn't start with race, I wouldn't start with blackness, I wouldn't start with gender, I wouldn't start with feminism. I would start with stripping down to what fundamentally informs my life, which is that I'm a seeker on the path. I think of feminism, and I think of anti-racist struggles as part of it, but where I stand spiritually is steadfastly on the path of love." Thank you.
Good morning. This is Reverend Dr. Pauli Murray, a trailblazing legal scholar and activist who dauntlessly challenged sex and gender discrimination and the points at which they intersect. She referred to these as Jane and Jim Crow, respectively. She dedicated her entire legal career to the sole intention of ending Jim Crow, or at least equipping herself with the tools to chip away at it. She boldly took a microscope to the Black female experience in America to examine its complexities and nuances. But by 1941, she had been rejected from Columbia, Barnard, the University of North Carolina, and Harvard based on her race and gender. And this may have caused her to realize the inseparability of her race, gender, and sexuality as a central part of her identity and experience, an idea ahead of its time in its own right. However, her unsung legacy lies in her written work, multiple of which were cornerstones for major milestones in the civil rights movement. For example, a paper she wrote in her third year at Howard University Law School challenged and masterminded the equal part of the separate but equal doctrine you all may be familiar with that was the foundation of the Plessy versus Ferguson case. The strategy that she wrote about was used in court during the Brown versus Board of Education case, but never recognized on account of her being openly queer and gender nonconforming. She also masterminded the women's rights movements ahead of her time, claiming that gender and sex discrimination should matter just as much as racial discrimination. She co-authored a groundbreaking article with Dorothy Kenyon arguing that Equal Protection Act should apply to sex discrimination. This article was quoted by the then attorney Ruth Bader Ginsburg to argue that gender discrimination was unconstitutional. And so what? And why does that matter to us? What does that have to do with our motto, Nanud Sibi? A quote from Reverend Dr. Pauli Murray says that when my brothers try to draw a circle to exclude me, I will draw a larger circle to include them. And circling back to Mr. Allen's presentation yesterday, I think this quote has a lot to do with how being a part of a community such as this takes work, and using the word love as an action, as a verb, and not just as a noun. Whose voices can we augment, and what large circles can we draw to call each other in and not just out? And a final quote, as you can see up here, says that true community is based upon equality, mutuality, and reciprocity. And it affirms the richness of individual identity and diversity, as well as the common human ties that bind us together. Thank you.
Born Mamie Carthen on November 23, 1921, Mamie Till Mobley grew up in rural Mississippi, but migrated with her family from the South to Chicago, Illinois, to avoid Jim Crow segregation laws. It was here in Chicago where Mamie raised her only child, Emmett Till. Mamie's Uncle Moses invited Emmett to visit his Mississippi farm, and although Mamie was initially apprehensive, she let him go. Mamie recommended that Emmett avoided white people because racism in the South was far more extreme than it was up north. At the train station, they hugged for such a long time that Emmett almost missed his train. While in Mississippi, Emmett and his cousins visited a store ran by a white woman named Carolyn Bryant to buy candy. While sitting on the porch of the store, Emmett whistled. The whistle was not directed at anyone, yet Carolyn was convinced of otherwise. She insisted that Emmett did more than whistle. She claimed that he had asked her on a date and that he had grabbed her waist. Emmett's cousins insisted that none of this had happened. Regardless, white men with guns had kidnapped Emmett in the middle of the night. After an extensive search for Till's body by Mamie and her family, and asking for help from local newspapers, the NAACP, and the White House, Emmett's body was found in a nearby river, weighed down by a large fan and barbed wire. He had been shot and beaten almost beyond recognition, though he was later identified by the ring he wore, which had his father's initials inscribed. The local authorities wanted to bury Emmett right away. After negotiations that involved the Chicago congressman, plans were finally made to bring Emmett home. At the funeral home, Mamie insisted she see Emmett's mangled face and body. As she looked at her son, Mamie had one thought: let the people see what they did to my boy, and she ordered an open casket viewing. Nearly 100,000 people viewed Emmett's body over 4 days. They too were worried about the safeties of their families in the South. They too felt powerless to protect their children. Mamie granted a photographer from the national black magazine Jet permission to photograph Emmett's body and publish the pictures. Although every major newspaper in the country covered Emmett's funeral, it was only a few black publications that printed photographs of his body. Black Americans came to know these images well, yet the vast majority of white Americans did not. 2 men were arrested for Emmett's murder: Carolyn's husband, Roy Bryant, and his half-brother, J.W. Milan. Uncle Moses identified them as the men who came to his house looking for Emmett, but all this evidence was unlikely to matter in an all-white jury in Mississippi. The public funeral brought extra attention to the trial, and reporters and civil rights activists from across the country were in attendance. On Friday, November 23, 1955, the jury returned a verdict of quote-unquote not guilty, after just over an hour of deliberations. 2 days later, Mamie was on a stage before 10,000 people in Harlem. Civil rights leader A. Philip Randolph organized the protest and spoke passionately about the injustice of the verdict. Mamie went on tour with the NAACP, not the NCAA, sorry about that, which organized a series of events around Emmett's story. In October, Mamie visited 33 cities in 19 states. She told the crowd she was no longer sad, instead she was just plain angry. Emmett's death was going to wake up Black America to fight for change. In the late 1980s, Emmett's story was part of a major PBS documentary. For the first time, white America saw the images of Emmett's battered body that Black America had seen just decades earlier. Mamie Till Mobley did not do this work to gain the title of an activist. However, her vast and exhaustive efforts to raise awareness of the unjustifiable brutality against Black men in the South had, in itself, contributed to the growing civil rights movement. People of all races were outraged, and government officials across the country received angry letters demanding justice. In the years to come, people like Rosa Parks, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and John Lewis pointed to Emmett Till's funeral as a turning point in the fight for racial justice in America. And that's all. So thank you so much for listening. It's important that we also recognize the heroines in the civil rights movement, and thank you.